have been with the museum since 2002. First in our collections department, working with survivors and liberators and their families who had material that they wanted to donate to the museum. And then after I got my PhD in American history in 2015, I moved over to work on the museum's current special exhibition, which is dark, as the museum is dark, but still totally available online and will be available again once the museum reopens, hopefully soon. And now I work in our education initiatives department, specifically tasked with helping middle and high school teachers teach this. It's a really tricky topic to teach. And so we do our best to create resources, to be here if anybody needs help with that. And my specialty, as Lori said, is the United States during the Holocaust. And this is a topic that can be woven in all sorts of different ways. If you teach American history, if you teach ELA, there are ways to engage your students in what Americans could have known and did know, and what they could and did do about what they were learning as the Holocaust was happening. So I'm going to share my screen and then kind of talk through the history a little bit. But as Lori said, any questions you have, even if it's not something that I seem to be covering, put it in the chat, because I'm here as a resource for you. Ask me anything that your students ask. Ask me anything that has always been a burning question for you, and I can hopefully deal with anything you can throw at me. So I am going to share my screen, make sure everybody can see it. Can I get a thumbs up either from Lori or Juanita? I can see you guys. Okay, cool. So to understand US response to the Holocaust and to understand Americans' responses to the Nazi persecution of Jews, I always go back to World War I. The United States is only involved in the war for a very short period of time, but that whole experience of World War I, of the seeming failure of the Treaty of Versailles, of the really terrible discussions in the Senate over the League of Nations, the worldwide influenza pandemic in 1918 and 1920. All of those things kind of convinced Americans that we need to retreat into isolationism, that going across the sea only brings back trouble for the United States. And so Americans in the 1920s become very isolationist, paring down our military, declaring that we are never going to go to war again. It is better if we stay on our side of the Atlantic and deal with domestic problems at home. The United States is also a segregated nation at this point, right? Legally in some places, by custom in others, and Americans are very concerned about race and genetics. This is the big moment for eugenic thinking and eugenic scientific arguments at the time. This belief that biologically some people are better than others, and that we need to create tiers of society, the good people and the bad people, and that could be determined by someone's race and someone's genetic background. Eugenics leads to policies of forced sterilization. This is the same decade in the 1920s as Buck versus Bell, the idea that the state can forcibly sterilize people who are considered bad, with bad genes. This is also the rise of the second Ku Klux Klan, which reaches its peak in the mid-1920s. Some historians estimate there are at least 10 million members of the Klan at this point in a country of 120 million people. This is from a Klan rally in Washington in 1927. And it was a very open thing. There were a number of governors who were card-carrying proud members of the Ku Klux Klan. And this Klan was not just against African Americans. This Klan was against Catholics. It was against immigrants. It was against Jews. It wanted people who were quote unquote 100% American. That was what the Klan stood for at this point in the 1920s. So all of these factors, this racism and eugenic thought, this idea of isolationism, and this idea of 100% Americans, that all coalesces in the 1920s with America's first major immigration laws. There's the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, but the big law is the 1924 Johnson-Reed Immigration Act. It totally changes the way that immigration is legal, is under law in America. So before that, there are several restrictions on immigration. There's the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. There are restrictions against Japanese immigration, but This is the moment in the 1920s when this idea that people can just go to Ellis Island and present their papers, and if they were healthy enough, they could be entered into the United States. That ends in the 1920s. Ellis Island is no longer the place where you go to get approval into the United States. That happens in your home country, and that happens with State Department diplomats giving you a visa that allows you to get to the US. So no more presenting your papers. You can wave at the Statue of Liberty with ease because all of the hard work, all of the paperwork is done in the country where you're living before you can immigrate to the United States. The Johnson-Reed Immigration Act has a couple of things beyond this. It established a quota based on your country of birth. So there was an overall cap on immigration at about 153,000 people per year who could immigrate to the United States. And that 153,000 was then subdivided by country. So this many slots for people born in Germany, this many slots for people born in Great Britain, this many slots for people born in Italy. And because this was a moment for eugenic science and the idea that where you came from determined what kind of immigrant you were going to be, what kind of person you were going to be, they gave far greater numbers of quota slots to countries in Northern and Western Europe, places where good white Protestants lived, so that we would get good white Protestant immigrants, and far fewer numbers of visas to places like Southern and Eastern Europe, where Jews and Catholics tended to live. Almost no slots available for anybody from Africa, and there was an entire Asiatic barred zone, whole areas of Asia from which you could not immigrate at all. These laws are in place until 1965 with very few changes. So you can see this is a slide from right after the war. So there's a couple of things that are different, but you can see that there's an unrestricted zone. So anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, there are no numerical restrictions. You're not under that 153,000 cap. They were not worried about immigrants from Mexico, from Central and South America. We needed them for the labor. But areas throughout the rest of the world where most immigration was coming at this point, there's the quota zone where there are some barriers, but not total. And then the barred zone is most areas of Asia. There is also something missing from this Immigration Act of 1924, and that's the question of refugees. The US has no refugee policy until after World War II. You cannot come as a migrant, you cannot come and seek asylum, you cannot come as a refugee. You can only come as an immigrant. And you have to go through the same immigration paperwork no matter what. Even if you're escaping religious and racial persecution, you need to fill out all of the paperwork, you need to be in the lines, you need to follow the same procedures as any other ordinary time. There is no carve out for any sort of refugee admission. So this 1924 law works pretty well for about 5 years. And then in 1929, the stock market crashes. The United States and the rest of the world descends into an economic depression. And Herbert Hoover, the president at the time, decided that he wanted to make sure that the United States was not hampered by the presence of additional immigrants, that immigrants might take American jobs. And to stop that, he ordered the State Department to reinforce what was called the likely to become a public charge clause from a very old, or not very old, 1917 immigration law. It was an older provision that hadn't been really used until 1930. And Hoover tells the State Department diplomats who are reviewing people's paperwork and granting visas, make sure that nobody is likely to become a public charge. They interpret this very strictly. And so by 1920 or by 1930 and 1931, if you did not have enough money to support yourself basically indefinitely in the United States, even if you never got a job here, you could no longer immigrate. And you can see here how this kind of manifests, right? So here are some of the numbers from before Hoover's instructions, and then 1931, immigration drops 90,000 in a single year. By 1933, 8,220 people immigrate to the United States total. It is the lowest number of recorded immigration. Actually, more people leave the United States in 1933 than come into the United States. So Hoover's instruction has a real impact. 1933, of course, is the year that Franklin Roosevelt becomes president, takes the oath of office here on March 4th, anniversary today. He promises the country a new deal. He vows that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. At this point, it is still 25% unemployment in the United States. And Americans are nervous about this. You know, the president is telling them not to be worried. They are looking around. We are an isolationist nation. We are a nation dealing with racism. We are a nation under severe economic depression. And Americans are worried that they actually have a lot to fear. One of the things that they're worried about is a new leader in Germany. Adolf Hitler has been appointed Chancellor of Germany about 6 weeks before Roosevelt takes office. And Americans know about him. He is on the cover of magazines, he is in newspapers, and Americans are watching what is happening in Germany. This magazine here, this Vanity Fair, is actually from November 1932. So it is from 2 months prior to Hitler being appointed Chancellor of Germany. And so think about that for a little bit, that there is a foreign political party not in power that the people at Vanity Fair expect that you know enough about, that they can do a parody of the iconography of that political party, and you as an American will understand what they're talking about. I don't think there's any political party today that you could show their symbol and Americans across the country would know what that was about. But they do with Adolf Hitler. Reports of the early persecution of German Jews, of Jews being kicked out of the civil service, of Jews being taken out of schools, of the burning of books, of the boycott on Jewish businesses. This is all front page news in the United States in the spring of 1933, just as Roosevelt is taking office, just as he is beginning the New Deal. We have a project at the museum that I can talk more about later if you want, called History Unfolded. It is a crowdsourced newspaper project where you can actually go in, you can participate in collecting newspaper articles, but you can also go in and use the menu and look at what things people have already submitted. So you can look by newspaper, by town, by state, by city, and see what was reported about the Holocaust, about the early persecution of Jews, about anything throughout this period, and use it in your classrooms. I love this resource. I use it all the time. And this is one that I got from History Unfolded. So here's the Charlotte Sunday Observer from April 2nd, 1933. And you can see that the big headline, like there's a local news headline, right? But the big headline is Nazi boycott paralyzes Jewish trade. Every Semitic store stands empty while pickets guard. This is the day after the boycott of Jewish-owned businesses in Germany. And the Charlotte Sunday Observer assumes that you know that this is happening. They want to tell you more about how it went. This was something that was announced in advance in the United States. So there are articles leading up to the boycott of Jewish-owned businesses, and then articles like this one telling you how it went. And this is throughout the country. And there's an impact on this. All of this newspaper reporting has an impact, and we can tell that people read it because they respond to it. In going through State Department records, there are over 500 petitions from the spring and summer of 1933 of different organizations, not just Jewish ones, but different organizations throughout the country, cities, states, fraternal groups. This is the United Hebrew Brotherhood, Hebrew United Brotherhood of Charlotte, who protest what the Nazis are doing, who write to their government and say, can you please, you know, submit some sort of protest, do something to make the Nazis stop. So the Hebrew United Brotherhood says there is a protest meeting held in this city on March 27th relative to the persecution of the people in Germany at the present time. So they send this before the boycott of businesses, before book burning has happened. There's already enough that they think that they need to fix this. So they say, we, the people of this community, regard these persecutions and atrocities as being in violation of the principles of humanity and decency and having no place in the affairs of nations today. Our government has always taken a stand for the alleviation of persecution and oppressed people the world over. That part is debatable. However, you can say this is something that they're caring about. This is something that there was an assembled meeting in Charlotte about this, and they have requested that their government do something. This kind of falls off the front pages of newspapers by the end of the spring of 1933. The persecutions, there aren't these big stories coming out of Germany. The New Deal is ramping up, and so it starts to fall slowly off the front pages. And so the US government never officially responds to all of these petitions, all of these calls, all of these rallies that are happening throughout the country. And Americans largely stop paying attention. They pay attention a few times over the course of the 1930s. You know, Americans debate whether or not the US should participate in the 1936 Olympics, which were in Berlin. They debate and discuss the Nuremberg race laws in 1935, which stripped citizenship from German Jews. But largely Americans are doubling and tripling down on isolationism. They're saying whatever happens overseas, you know, Japan invades China at this time, and America is like, we're not going to get involved. The Spanish Civil War begins, we're not going to get involved. Germany is continuing to persecute Jews, we're not going to get involved. But for a lot of people who are trying to immigrate to the United States, they still see this promise of America. They still see the United States as a place where an immigrant can go and can create a life for themselves that's different than most other countries. Throughout the early 1930s, when this likely to become a public charge clause is really strongly in effect, there's about 90,000 people, Germans, who are on a waiting list to get into the United States. The State Department slowly begins to open it up a little bit, to not rely so heavily on that likely to become a public charge restriction. But the quotas, that cap on immigration, is not maxed out. They are not issuing the maximum number of visas that could be issued to people born in Germany. In 1933, the first full year that Hitler is in power in Germany, only a little more than 4,000 visas are issued to people born in Germany out of a possible almost 26,000 that were legally available to people. So let's talk for a second about what it took to immigrate to the United States. So first you have to deal with the fact that there's a cap, right? There's only a certain number of people who can get in any year. Those people, anybody who wanted to try to get to the United States, have to prove their identity. They have to show birth certificates, military discharge papers, marriage certificates, passports. They have to show that they're good citizens. They have to have letters of recommendation in some cases from members of their community. They need an authorization from the German police saying that they're not a criminal. They need to pass a medical exam from a State Department approved physician that they're not bringing any disease into the United States, that they're healthy enough to work. And they still have to prove that they're not going to be a financial burden. This is still during the Depression. In 1937 and 1938, almost a decade into the Depression, we're still at 19% unemployment. So it's still very high. And so you still did have to prove that you were not going to need any sort of financial support if you made it here. For most people, that meant that you needed a financial sponsor. You needed an American who would vouch for you, who would legally take responsibility for you and say, I will support this person if they are allowed to come to the United States and they need any sort of financial assistance. That person, that American, needed to submit multiple years of their tax forms. They needed to submit their own letters of good character from prominent members of their community, from the head of the local bank, the head of the insurance company, saying this person has this much money in their account. This person does have an insurance policy that would cover things. Letters from prominent citizens saying that they're good people who will not abandon their relatives or not abandon their friends if those people are allowed to immigrate to the US. All of these things had expiration dates. So the document, your tax forms would only be good for a certain amount of time. Your letter of character would only be good for a certain period of time. And so if everything doesn't line up, if that person's interview and appointment at the US consulate for their interview doesn't line up with their medical certificate, doesn't line up with the letters that they're getting from the United States, and all of this is being done by mail, they could be sent back to the line and told to go get different paperwork, go get another form, another copy. The ramifications of this are real. This is a time when there is an emergency going on and people need to get out of this country. And the US law does not recognize any sort of need to speed things up for an emergency. That's one of the fundamental problems. So Dorothy Thompson, the very famous journalist at the time, wrote, "It is a fantastic commentary on the inhumanity of our times that for thousands and thousands of people, a piece of paper with a stamp on it is the difference between life and death." It is clear by 1938, 5 years into Hitler and the Nazi rule of Germany, that life in Germany is becoming unbearable for Jews. In March, Nazi Germany had annexed Austria, bringing another almost 200,000 Jews under Nazi control, and all of the restrictions on Jewish life immediately were applied to Austrian Jews. Thousands wait outside. This is a very crude picture of people outside one of the government branches in Austria. I'm not sure if it's the US consulate, but we have photos of the time of thousands of people waiting outside some of these places, trying to collect their paperwork to get out. Roosevelt combines the German and the Austrian quotas numbers, but it's still a cap of 27,370 people per year who can get to the United States legally. He also decides that this is an international problem that needs an international solution. So he calls for a conference in Evian, France. 32 nations come to this conference, but you can see the yes, but attitude perils progress. Most of these countries, including the United States, say we are not going to change our immigration laws. The cap is the cap. It is what it is. We will fill that cap, but we will not expand it. This is also the same period of time where a group of US congressmen, Jewish congressmen, decide amongst themselves that it is not even worth opening the question of any new immigration legislation, that the issue is so toxic in the United States that it is easier to just try to keep things as they are and not even have the debate, because the debate will only result in lowering the number of people who can come, not in raising it. Theoretically, though, people can still get out. We did a lot of research at the museum in trying to establish exactly how physically immigration worked. How are people moving? I'm trying to make my thing go up. Hang on one second. So you can see here that people are immigrating in the spring of 1938 from all over Europe. All of the ships that you see on the screen are carrying people who self-identified as Jewish refugees. And helping them immigrate to the United States. So you can see there are dozens of ships a month coming from all over Europe. And in a couple of minutes, I'll show you what it looks like in a couple of years after that. It is a very different picture. After Kristallnacht, though, things change. So Kristallnacht, the attacks on Jews throughout Germany, which now includes Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia in November 1938, causes massive headlines throughout the world and throughout the United States. The Nazis unleash a terror campaign across the areas they control. Hundreds of synagogues are burned. More than 30,000 Jewish men and boys are arrested and sent to concentration camps. This is the longest sustained newspaper coverage of any event related to the persecution of Jews in American newspapers. This is front page news for about 3 weeks. You can see this is the LA Examiner, November 23rd, so almost 2 weeks after Kristallnacht. The headline is, "Nazis warn world Jews will be wiped out unless evacuated by democracies." Roosevelt does a couple of things. He publicly condemns the Kristallnacht attacks. He says that he can scarcely believe that such things would happen in a civilized society. He brings back the US ambassador to Germany as a sign of protest. The US is the only country that withdraws its ambassador as a response to Kristallnacht. And he also decides that he will permit people who are here on visitors visas, so travelers who are from Germany and don't feel safe going home, he will allow them to stay. And we have collections in the museum from people who did not end up going back home to Germany and ended up staying the war here and survived because of that, because of this decision. Americans are really conflicted about this refugee crisis. They understand that something terrible is happening in Germany, but they are not convinced that the United States needs to form any part of the solution to this problem. So these polls here, I think, summarize that. This is the end of November 1938, and Americans are asked by Gallup, do you approve or disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany? 94% of Americans disapprove. And then the same group of people are then asked, should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles from Germany to come to the United States to live? And 72% of Americans say no. So it's this gap between being really sympathetic from what is happening and yet still not being willing to allow these people to actually come here, kind of goes over this entire period. There's this persistent disconnect here. And thousands of people are now joining this waiting list from across Europe trying to get into the United States. The State Department starts filling the German quota. The maximum number of people are coming who can come under US law, but that is still only 27,370 people per year. And you can see that by January 1st, 1939, still 9 months before World War II starts, there are 247,000 people on the waiting list. The German quote is actually pretty big because in the 1920s, they're thinking, well, Germany is full of white Protestants, so we can give them a lot of visas. When you go further east, the numbers get even more dire. Romania had a quota of 377. 377 people born in Romania could immigrate to the United States any given year. And by 1939, even though Nazi Germany is not controlling Romania, 16,000 people are on the waiting list, which represents numerically a 43-year wait for anybody who joins that waiting list. Americans are polled around this time with another question. If you are a member of the new Congress, would you vote yes or no on a bill to open us up to a larger number of European refugees than are now admitted under the quotas? And 83% say no. I mean, it is a majority. It is a very massive majority. I don't think you can poll almost anything in the United States these days at 83% of people being on one side or the other. There is a lot of movement in Congress, and not just among, this is not a Democrat-Republican divide, actually. This is bipartisan against opening up immigration. Some of the loudest voices against immigration were Democrats, were Roosevelt's own party, which made things very complicated for him, because if he tried to buck them on immigration, then they are going to buck him on the New Deal. Robert Reynolds, one of the loudest voices, was a Democrat from North Carolina. And he wrote a form letter to constituents in March 1939, to constituents and to people that he thought would be on his side, saying, all the nations of impoverished Europe wish to dump their political, economic, and undesired minorities upon us. So write to your senators and your congressmen to aid me to put legislation on the books, which will shut off immigration entirely during this period of unemployment and hardship and distress for young and old among our people, and to expel from this country the alien propagandist, the habitual criminal, and the alien diseased or insane. So spring 1939, when he sends this, newspaper reports are already coming out that Europe is on the brink of war. There's already been, Germany has already taken over Austria, they've taken over parts of Czechoslovakia. Now they've taken, in March 1939, the rest of Czechoslovakia. It gets very clear that the line is being crossed and is going to be crossed in a way that leads to war very, very soon. And Americans are convinced that we need to stay neutral. So one of Reynolds' refrains, even at the question of bringing refugee children to the United States, is that America's children are America's problem and Europe's children are Europe's problem, and we will let them deal with what is happening over there. For the first few months of World War II, some in Western Europe call it the phony war. After Nazi Germany invades Poland, England and France say that they declare war and go to war against Germany, but there isn't a lot of fighting once Poland is defeated. Then in the spring of 1940, Nazi Germany invades first Denmark and Norway, and then the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. By mid-June, only within about 6 weeks, France has fallen. France falls remarkably quickly, frighteningly quickly for Americans. Americans are thinking, Poland is way over there. Maybe I have relatives there, but it's been a long time. I've not been to Poland. Americans had been to France, many of them, and they could see images of Hitler standing on the Eiffel Tower. And they realized suddenly that Great Britain is now the only power left, the only bulwark between the United States and Nazi Germany. And so the war starts to feel really real to Americans. And they begin to worry that America is vulnerable. If France fell so quickly, maybe we would fall too. We have a much larger coastline, of course, than France, and a much, much smaller army. When Europe goes to war, the United States has the 17th largest army in the world, behind Bulgaria, behind Belgium. We had spent the 20s and 30s paring down our army. And so this idea that now there's this war and they may invade us and we don't have the manpower and the training to defend ourselves, that was something that was really real and scary to Americans. And so Americans start to worry that there are spies and saboteurs inside our country who are going to bring the country down. June 1940, as France is falling, 71% think that is already happening, 22% aren't sure. So 93% of Americans think that there is likely spies and saboteurs ready to bring us down the second the Nazis land on our shores. The FBI starts getting tips and starts ginning up this fear. This is J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, and they start talking about how immigrants might be coming to the United States, whose loyalties might not be as good Americans. Even they said Jewish refugees who, you know, don't want to commit acts of spying and sabotage against their new country, but maybe the Nazis are holding their parents, their relatives hostage in Nazi Germany in exchange for acts of spying and sabotage. So this results really in a real change in immigration. That and the war. So I showed you some of the video before. This is 1941. This is after France has fallen. This is after there have been more restrictions placed on immigration. Sorry, let me go back for a second and actually play this. So you can see now that whereas before ships were coming from all over Europe, now basically your port of exit is Lisbon. And so anybody who is anywhere in Western Europe, in Germany, you have to make your way, you have to get all of your paperwork in order, you have to get your visa, and you have to make your way through a continent at war in order to find your way to a ship that can take you to the United States. It is not an act, it is not security theater, it is very scary for Americans. And so they decide that that they are going to restrict immigration even further. They're going to put more barriers in place on people who are trying to come, calling on people to present more paperwork, more evidence that they are not spies, and they're going to put the burden on the potential immigrant. It is your job to show us that you are going to be a good American and a good person and not a spy. So this is June 1941. America just says no visas of any category will be issued to these aliens. They change that a little bit, and they make it now that now there's a interdepartmental visa review committee. So all paperwork for any potential immigrant needs to be sent to Washington. There's a committee. They build a building on the National Mall to house this basically court. And all of your paperwork will be considered. Maybe your sponsor has to come to Washington and testify on your behalf, all before you can get approval to immigrate. And so this adds weeks and months to what is now a very desperate situation for people trying to get out. After July 1941, very, very few can escape. And after October 1941, Germany makes immigration illegal from its territory. And then, of course, 2 months later, Pearl Harbor begins. Or Pearl Harbor, that attack leads the United States to officially declare war on Nazi Germany, and Nazi Germany to declare war on us as we go to war against also Japan. The war is not about saving the Jews. It is not about rescuing Jews. These are two posters, propaganda posters from 1942, showing that Americans are told that this is about freedom. This is about democracy. This is about our freedom to worship. This is about our constitutional values. Those are the things that Americans are fighting for. We're fighting for the survival of democracy in the world. We are not fighting to save Jews in any sort of way. The United States does not go to war to rescue Jews. But in 1942, a year after Pearl Harbor, Americans do learn about the final solution. They learn that the Nazis have moved on from just persecuting Jews. They are now trying to murder all of the Jews of Europe. This message kind of trickles out in different ways. There are rumors about this in 1940 and 1941, kind of buried in the backs of newspapers because it was felt very suspicious information. It was like, this town in the Soviet Union has been wiped out by Nazi Germany. And what they mean is that there was a mass shooting operation and the Jews of the town were taken out and shot. But for many Americans who, again, are isolationists, had been very nervous about the idea of going to war, they read this as, this is just rumors about how terrible the Nazis are. This is just a way to get us to fight, a way to get us to join the war effort by talking about how all of this unsubstantiated rumors about what the Nazis are doing, by talking about they're murdering women and children. That's what you do when you want someone to fight. You talk about how evil the enemy is. And so they saw this as propaganda. By 1942, though, it's been verified. It's been verified by the State Department, the Vatican, the Red Cross, all of these agencies and groups saying, no, this is actually what is happening. So by November 1942, this information that the Nazis have this plan and are trying to carry it out has been verified and is available in American newspapers and treated as verified information. So throughout 1942 and 1943, more and more information trickles out. It is more often treated as verified, and Americans debate what to do about this. Should we just focus on the war effort, which is what the Roosevelt administration originally said, like, we're just going to win the war as soon as possible. That is what we're going to do to help. But there's more and more public pressure on the United States to do something to rescue Jews or aid Jews and other people being persecuted. And in the fall of 1943, there's a debate going on within the Roosevelt administration. The Treasury Department is saying we need to do more. The State Department is saying we're just going to win the war as soon as possible. Let's not get in the way of this. The Treasury Department finally starts investigating, like, why is the State Department getting in our way about this? And they learn that members of the State Department, including the Assistant Secretary of State, had specifically told Jewish representatives in Switzerland to stop sending information about the Holocaust to the United States, that information was trickling out to activists who were pressuring the government to do something about rescuing Jews. And if those activists didn't know what was happening to the Jews in Europe, they wouldn't be pressuring the government to do anything about it. So the Treasury Department thinks this is terrible, obviously. They decide they're going to go straight to President Roosevelt, that they are going to tell him that what the State Department is doing and call on him to create a new government agency tasked with trying to rescue Jews. They present this information to him in January 1944, and Roosevelt agrees. He issues an executive order creating what was called the War Refugee Board, and their job was to try to rescue and provide relief for Jews. So in 1944, the US finally has a policy about the Holocaust. It is a policy of rescue and relief. By the end of the war, a year and a half later, this agency has saved tens of thousands of lives. They have sent packages into food packages into concentration camps. They have provided food for children in hiding. They have paid off border guards who are helping Jews escape into neutral areas. They managed to get 8,000 people out of Romania and Bulgaria and into pre-state Israel. They started a propaganda warfare campaign, trying to convince Nazis and collaborators to stop what they were doing. They opened a refugee camp in upstate New York called Fort Ontario in Oswego, New York, bringing about 1,000 mostly Jewish refugees to live there from Europe. This is the only group of refugees brought outside of US immigration policy during the war, specifically to rescue them from the Holocaust. And the reason that the US did this is largely because of leverage, because we were putting pressure on other countries to take Jews over their borders, and those countries were turning around and saying, well, why hasn't the US taken any? So they opened this camp in upstate New York, and bring all of these families and surround them with barbed wire. They also issue a report giving Americans detailed information for the first time on Auschwitz, on the famous killing center, famous now killing center. But in in November 1944, it was really, for most Americans, the first time they had ever heard of this camp. The first time that they had heard that the Nazis have a gassing operation. And this is a very detailed report. It was written by escapees from Auschwitz. And details in very graphic detail the process of arrival and selection and gassing at Auschwitz. Without asking anybody in the federal government, this agency, the War Refugee Board, sends it to newspapers nationwide. And a week after it appears, front page in most newspapers, the Washington Post issues an editorial called Genocide. It was the first time the word genocide is used in an American newspaper. And they say, this is a new crime. And the War Refugee Board, in their discussion of Auschwitz, has introduced us to this new kind of crime. We need a word for it. This is the word genocide. This is the word that you all need to learn now. In the spring of 1945, Allied forces liberate camps throughout Germany. This is Ohrdruf. This is April 12th, 1945. You can see General Eisenhower here touring the Ohrdruf camp and reporting back and calling for newspaper reporters and journalists and photographers to come and witness liberation, saying that someday this might be charged as propaganda, and it's not propaganda. We need to document the crimes against the Nazis. Roosevelt does not see any of this. Franklin Roosevelt dies the same day that General Eisenhower tours Ohrdruf. So he does not live to see any images of liberation. After being president for 12 years, we talk about crazy news weeks and crazy news months. I submit to you that April 1945 is probably the craziest, or at least the most chaotic for most Americans. They've lost, in some cases, the only president that many of them had ever known. The war is coming to an end. Images of concentration camps are coming out. All of this is happening at once. And a week into May, VE Day, the victory again of the war in Europe, and Americans celebrate throughout the country. At the same time, the problem is not solved, right? You still have millions of people displaced in Europe, including 250,000 Jews liberated from concentration camps, and no real idea of what to do with them. And Americans have not changed their minds. They changed their minds about everything else. You know, the role of government, the strength of our military, the role of America in the world. We are never going to be totally isolationist again. We are a superpower now. But one thing does not change, and that is America's willingness to take immigrants and refugees. In December 1945, after the war in Europe and after the war against Japan ended, only 5% of Americans polled said that they wanted to take more refugees and more immigrants than they had prior to the war. So that is something that has not, or that had not changed after the war. I need to get to questions. Very quickly, I talk really fast and throw a lot at people. I know it, and I'm very sorry. If you have questions about this that I don't get to, or want to review it, or want to look at other photos, or there was a piece of it that you were really interested in and you want to look at it, the Americans in the Holocaust website, our web exhibit is pretty expansive and extensive. This is on our website at ushmm.org /Americans, or just go to the homepage and look for Americans in the Holocaust, and you can go through a whole history. There are photos, there's video, there are infographics that can help you, there are lesson plans that can help you. We also have a tour, a video. We were lucky enough that C-SPAN recorded a tour with our curator, going through the actual exhibit in Washington. Last summer, we pared that down to a 37-minute tour. So you can show that in your class. There are worksheets, there are lesson plans around that. We've got lots of stuff. And like I said, the History Unfolded website is also really, really good in looking at what was happening in your community And in a lot of cases, you can find and show the actual newspaper articles. We've had teachers find, you know, Nazi rallies or anti-Nazi rallies at buildings that are still there, that are down the street from their school. So places that their students know. And that's always a really good way to bring this into your classroom. I am trying now to stop sharing my screen, and my screen has just gone black. I'm just going to assume that you can still hear me, and that I am, yes, screen sharing has stopped. Perfect. So any questions that you all have with the time that we have left, and if we don't get to it or you want to, then I'm happy to answer questions over email. Treasury was so one of the questions in the chat is, why was the Treasury Department taking the lead? So World War II was the first year that we had economic sanctions. It's really not popular, but it is a very strong way now that the US expresses its displeasure that we wage war, we wage economic war, we restrict people's ability to spend money or have access to the banking system. That's how the US does it now. Back then, we just had very rudimentary economic sanctions. We were trying to keep Nazi Germany from stealing the assets of the countries that it invaded, or being able to steal assets from Americans or people who had money or bank accounts in any of those countries. So the Treasury Department is involved with the sanctions program and had to grant permission to organizations who wanted to send relief money into areas that were under sanction. So that's how the Treasury Department gets involved, is they hear from Jewish organizations who want to send money into France and into Romania to help Jewish groups. So that's how they get involved. The PowerPoint is not available. I can check rights on it. I don't have any problem sharing it. So as long as, I'll double check that I'm not showing anything that has any sort of restriction, and if I am, I'll just swap something. But I can send it to Lori and she can distribute it. The quota situation for immigration and refugees today. Heck if I know, honestly. You could have asked me a couple months ago, and I think it's very different in the last couple of weeks. It is not easy, and I can say that all of the restrictions that were in place in the 1930s are not that different now, right? You still have to show evidence of where you were born. You still have to show your identity. In a lot of cases, you do need some sort of sponsorship. It doesn't work the same way in the US now, that you need a financial sponsor, an individual now, but there are organizations that help with refugee resettlement. And you usually have to get connected with one of those organizations that will help you find a job in the US and help you find an apartment when you get here. There's still caps on refugee admissions, and those caps since 1980 have been determined by the president. So it has been largely bipartisan until the recent administration. Like, it didn't really depend on being a Republican or a Democrat as to whether the numbers were up or down. It kind of depended on the priorities of the president and on how the U.S. economy was doing. The numbers fell, raised a bit during Obama, fell during Trump, and are now raised a bit. But the structure for immigration is way out of whack right now, and a lot of the people aren't in the places that they need to be to encourage immigration. And so there's a lot of rebuilding, I think, that has to be done. How active was the Bund? The German-American Bund was an organization that was made up largely of first and second generation German immigrants. It was really popular in the mid to late part of the 1930s, and then thankfully got taken down by a tax scam. That's the way, what is it? Al Capone goes to, you get him on tax evasion. That's how they got the head of the German-American Bund, is he had tax evasion. They end up deporting him. And thankfully that meant that after really 1939, the Bund really declined in prominence. Their big thing though was operating summer camps throughout the country. Operating summer camps where German-American families could go, they could learn about the new Nazi party, they could speak German, they could do German dances and eat German food, and train their youth in Hitler-style athletics and uniform wearing and anti-Semitism. So it was not a terrible thing that this went south. They only really had, I think historians estimate, a max of about 25,000 card-carrying members, but they had a lot of people who were sympathetic. Mainly their camps were situated around major cities where people, first and second generations, tended to be, and in the Midwest, where there was a large German American population. The estimate of the total time it would take a potential immigrant. If you got on the list at the right time, say you decide in March 1938, the second that Germany takes Austria, that you want to immigrate to the United States, you could potentially leave by the end of the year. But that is if everything goes well, if your sponsor has money, if they don't have to go back to you, if you were one of the first people on the list. If you wait until after Kristallnacht, so if you wait 6 months and then get on the list, it will take you up to 2 or 3 years. There are people who got on the list in that I know of in December 1939, single woman, family in the US, could work, no medical problems. It takes her until 1941. So the list grows so exponentially in 1938 and 1939, the waiting list, that if you're not getting on the list until 1939, chances are you are not going to make it out. Am I available for virtual presentations? Sure. I'll put my email in here and Lori can also share it. I can't do every presentation, but if my schedule allows, then I'm happy to do it. The refugees from the camp in New York, I'm so glad you asked. I find this story fascinating, in part because I grew up in upstate New York and did not know this camp existed. It for a long time had just kind of been written out of upstate New York history, and is starting to come back. So they, after the war, were told that they were going to be going back. They had signed documents when they came to the US in August 1944 that they knew that they would be returned to Europe after the war. The Allies in Europe are like, we have all of these millions of people that we're trying to deal with. Why are you going to take these 1,000 people, many of whom had relatives in the US? Some of them had sons and daughters who were already fighting in the US Army, who had immigrated before the war. Why are you going to take them, bring them back to Europe, only to have them apply to come back? So there's a huge debate in the summer of 1945. There are 2 congressional inquiries, there are hearings at which the camp Boy Scout troop of young refugees testifies at these hearings to Congress about how they're going to be good Americans and they promise that in the future they will fight for our country, like that, all of that. Finally, in December 1945, all of those congressional debates weren't getting anywhere. And Truman finally announced that he thought the refugees would be allowed to stay, that he was going to use presidential privilege to allow them to stay. So in January and February 1946, so again, we're now almost 9 months after the end of the war in Europe, these refugees go to Canada. They apply for immigration at the Niagara Falls consulate, and then they cross back over with their official immigration papers for the first time. So it's absolutely fascinating, weird bureaucratic story, but it is absolutely so interesting, this idea of all of these refugees in this small town in upstate New York, 17 different nationalities, all of these different languages. The kids went to public school, so all of the teachers are suddenly teaching ESL. It was really, really interesting.